can you truly be free to play anymore? Is it possible? In the literal sense, yeah, it's possible, but it really will just ultimately depend on what your goals are with the game at this point, because in my opinion, we're definitely heading to a point where you really gotta hyper focus on what you want to do in this game. Those goals could either be something with just PvE maps, arena, aether raids, or even summoner duels, and some of them definitely have a way higher echelon in what you need to invest into versus, you know, obvious other ones. For example, PvE maps, you don't really need a whole lot to really get going. You get 2 free brave heroes and you get a bunch of other freebies and a bunch of free summons that could also just be a bunch of really good 5-stars, or it could be a bunch of really mediocre 3-star and 4-star units. That being said, PvE content usually varies, but ultimately offers the least amount of content from my experience, especially when you consider the fact that there's just a lot of other modes throughout the game that keep the player base busy, you know, like arena, aether raid, summoner duels. We do occasionally get other game modes that you don't necessarily need to have any sort of free-to-play or pay-to-win stuff to get going, because they more or less just provide you with all the tools necessary, whether that's Hall of Forms, Binding Worlds. Seer Snare is also one of those in technicality, even though you could still use your favorites for that. I find that Seer Snare is probably the most rewarding PvE thing we have at the moment, especially since a lot of the game balance makes it so most PvE maps are either just complete cakewalks that don't really require a lot of thought, or they're just obscenely difficult and make it so you don't really want to even play the map. And maybe this is a hot take, but I find that arena is probably the most pay-to-win part of the game. But I will say, unlike the other modes, you don't have to summon for specific legendaries at the end of the month just to keep up with scoring, even though you probably shouldn't be doing that anyway, because the return investment in going into arena is really piss poor anyway. That being said, if you do want to score well, you're going to need really good score bots and a bunch of really good legendaries that score relatively high to this day. And with the new arena change where you need one specific legendary for every single month, otherwise your score is just going to be kind of all over the place. That being said, you can still argue summoner duels, because not having specific skills or units does make the game mode a lot harder, although that does mostly apply to summoner duels R and S, which is definitely the more competitive aspect of the game. That being said, doesn't change the fact that you may also want specific skills like guidance, cancer control, even units like Brad Catria, or depending on some maps, Desert Lind. There's a lot of time and investment that goes into that mode, which you could definitely argue is not free to play friendly, especially since time is a currency in some aspects. I will say, out of anything in this game though, aether raids is probably the most free to play friendly thing in the game, and that's only because they give you 3 offense mythics for each season. And that is important in my opinion, because there is no requirement to run any sort of defense mythic on your defense team for you to score well. As long as you can make the foe surrender, you just don't lose any points. The big thing really just comes from your offense teams, and you get 3 mythics for free, so it's relatively friendly. That being said, regardless of the mode, people will run up on you and probably destroy you with the latest power creep stuff. But what's funny about power creep before versus now is that a lot of it is skill based in my opinion. I had a video about this maybe a few months ago, talk about how power creep is more now just about the skills less than the units, even though you can still argue that a lot of the power creep comes from powerful units. That being said, I still stand by skill creep more so than power creep, because I think we've just hit a plateau. Minus this guy, of course. But obviously before there was a lot more emphasis on units with PRFs, because nowadays you can just run a lot of the same stuff and more or less get away with most things as long as you have the proper skills for it. But that requires all the latest skills and all the latest power creep. And this is where the free-to-play part of it comes into more of an emphasis to me, because the process of keeping up is not exactly the most friendly. We get maybe around 300 orbs per month, and depending on how high you rank in certain game modes, maybe a estimate of 80,000 to 100,000 feathers per month, assuming you also play everything. And we get 3 new banners per month that isn't just reruns or revivals or anything of the sort, just all the new stuff. Only one of those is sparkable for free. The other 2 are locked behind FEH Pass, which can be really detrimental if a lot of the really amazing stuff is locked behind legendary mythic banners, because 1 in 3 chance is not exactly the most friendly. And that's also on top of gacha rates just being 3%, or I guess 6% if you want to include pity breakers too. There is a massive amount of upkeep you have to do in order to make sure that you can keep up with the game. And it doesn't help if you're just just starting out to this day, because then you have to catch up on all sorts of stuff. But I'm getting a bit of ahead of myself. I think the main thing is just where you draw the line with using meta or favorites, because again, everybody has certain goals with this game, and depending on what those goals are will ultimately determine whether or not you're going to be able to be as free to play as you want to be. For example, I think one of the biggest appeals to this game is just the vast amount of characters and being able to invest into any sort of character that you really like. But depending on what that favorite is or how old they are, then it can become even more troublesome than it's really worth. For example, you want to build a Gen 1 Hinata. You might want all these flowers on them, which is probably the least of your concern, mainly because it is stats, but it is a significant amount of stats by this point. In my opinion, they really should just reverse the flower count, where it costs less to give flowers to older units and costs more to give it to modern units. And no matter how many flowers you give to these old units, they're not ever going to be on the same level as anything modern anyway. That aside, you also have the need for all these modern inheritables, which some are easy to get, some are limited time, and that also doesn't help when they're also not guaranteed sparks, especially if you miss them from the get-go. There's the must-need modern inheritables, and this isn't even just a matter of A slot, B slot, C slot. You may also need a specific weapon, some of which probably just aren't readily available for free, and other things that aren't accessible in the pool, including skills or bridge fodder that's just locked to seasonal units that only come around once a year, and you could only get them at this certain time, and blah blah blah. It's a pretty big mess of hurdles you have to get through to just make something that's just significantly worse than anything modern anyway, even if they are generic. I don't understand why they make it so difficult, because I feel like people would just have a lot more incentive to stay around if they just were able to invest in their favorites with much more ease. Obviously depending on the unit, of course, but they don't make it easy no matter what. Even with the 5 inheritance slots, a lot of the important bridge fodder just isn't around in the free-to-play pool, because yeah, they just think it's not really worth their time, I guess. I don't know. For those whose favorite is a meta unit though, congratulations, you just kind of win there. That aside though, whatever you might be pulling for and using on that specific unit might also just not become useful, or may just not outright work at the flip of an update whenever they drop whatever sort of banner or skill that completely invalidates it. And this isn't one of those things where I think every unit should be able to take on every unit, because I think that's really dumb. That being said, there are some things that just become so dominant that you're always just going to run into it, and it's going to become harder and harder to keep up with your favorites, which in my opinion also makes it less incentivizing to either stick around with the game, or it incentivizes you to probably try and pull for more of these skills, which could also become an issue if you don't have the orbs, you don't have this, you don't have that. It's a lot of upkeep basically, and it makes you wonder how feasible it is to be free to play at this starting point. And I guess to put it into perspective with radical shifts, let's talk about Elamine for a second. She's my favorite character in all of Fire Emblem, right? She came out at a time where she shut off pretty much 95% of defense gimmicks. I don't care what anybody says about the Bride Catcher thing with the res stacking. No, I don't believe that. I think that was just complete copium. That being said, she came out at a time where she pretty much shut off a lot of the ability for pretty much any unit to function in an Aetherite's defense setting, at least on defense, or I guess chaos technically too, until Freyr came along and completely stopped her. And then they introduced something that prevented Freyr from enabling catcher balls, and then Safi came out and odd recovery, and basically a lot of their game design is introduce the poison, sell the solution type deal, except sometimes they go way too far with the poison. But because they also keep doing this in rapid succession, it becomes harder to keep up, and this is where you might have to identify meta and power creep versus what you actually need to succeed. Even whatever you may need to succeed may be thrown out the window, because there's also a good chance that just may not work in the next update. That being said, for people starting out, at least you have a lot of story orbs and a lot of maps that you could do and a bunch of free units that you can get. You do also have to catch up on sacred seals, which is arguably going to be the hardest part in my opinion, because you need all these badges and coins that you can't easily get. If you want to get the coins from the shop, you need the spark on a lot of banners, and that requires pulling a lot of orbs and spending them and yada yada yada. There's also just a lot of information overload, which I imagine is a massive put off for a lot of people. There was this one graphic I saw with Japanese player base where a lot of their text was just completely organized, and then you look at the one over here and it's like a massive jumbled mess, and I don't understand why it couldn't just be summarized, or we couldn't have a glossary. Regardless, it is just a lot of information overload, even if it were organized, because we have over 1,000 units in the game. So I imagine this is just something that you're going to have to get used to over time, and isn't necessarily a free-to-play issue, but it may end up important regardless, because you may end up dictating what you need versus wants with, whoa, that's a lot of text. I'm sure sure I'm gonna need that. Well, that's really good. Shiny new toy syndrome, etc, etc. That being said, none of this really matters as long as you have a goal in mind at the end of the day. Some of them are going to be easier to accomplish than some of the other ones. Some of them are just going to be really difficult. Some of them also just require long-term investments. And really, it just depends on how much you want to get out of the game without either spending money or investing so much resources into the game to where it just isn't really feasible for you. But I will say, no matter what, some whale is probably going to bend you over backwards at the back of a McDonald's and